My name is Nadia, and I was 33 years old when my mother stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table and told her entire side of the family that my sister had married up and I had married nothing. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside. She said it in the middle of passing the bread, the way you'd state a fact everyone already knew. Renata found someone who understands what this family is building. Nadia made a different choice, and we respect that. Then she looked straight at me and added, "We just hope it works out for you." My husband Marco was sitting right beside me. He set down his coffee cup, slowly, with the particular care of a man who has decided not to react, and said, very quietly, "We'll be fine." I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say. Because there was something I already knew about Marco that my mother had never thought to look for. Something he had spent 15 years building in professional kitchens and consulting rooms, without ever once putting it on a business card at a family dinner. 1 year later, my mother walked into the soft opening of the hotel she had spent 4 years of her life building. The early reviews were already circulating. Every single one named the same consultant. She walked through the lobby doors and stopped. I want to start with my mother because this story only makes sense if you understand who Sylvia Kovac was before she became the woman who said what she said at that table. Sylvia grew up in a Croatian immigrant household in Cleveland, Ohio, third of 5 children, parents who ran a small import grocery on the east side of the city that kept the family housed and fed, but not comfortable. She married my father Gordon when she was 24. Gordon was a methodical, patient man who worked as an accountant and spent his evenings and weekends quietly accumulating what he called positions, small commercial properties in secondary markets across the Midwest, bought carefully, held long, never oversold. By the time I was in high school, my parents owned 4 properties outright and were leveraged on 2 more. They were not wealthy. But they were building, and the building was working, and my mother knew it, and it changed something in how she understood the world. She had grown up with very little margin. She had watched her own parents work themselves thin to give their children a foothold. And she had decided, somewhere in that watching, that the foothold was not the destination. It was the beginning. That her generation would climb from the foothold to something more, and her children's generation would climb from that, and so on, and the climbing required choices. Strategic ones, including who you married. We relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona, when I was 11 and my sister Renata was 8, following a business opportunity of my father's that turned out to be the right move. Scottsdale suited my mother. It had the architecture of aspiration, the kind of city where people who had made something of themselves came to display it, and where my mother's particular intelligence, the kind that understood rooms and relationships and the unspoken hierarchies of social events, had space to operate. She joined boards. She built a civic presence. She developed relationships with developers and hoteliers and the kind of philanthropists who fund things with their names on them. And she had an idea that she worked on for 6 years before it became a plan. A boutique hotel in Scottsdale's Arts District on a former residential hotel property that had been through 2 failed renovation attempts and was, finally, available. She called the project the Kovac at 5th. She named it after the family because she wanted it to mean something, to be a mark left by her generation on a city she had chosen. My father put in the equity. She secured an investment partner, a hospitality group called Meridian Collective, and a development loan from a regional bank whose president she'd met at a charity event 3 years earlier. The project was supposed to take 3 years. It took 4. There were contractor disputes and material delays, and a design firm change midway through that cost 8 months, and a significant budget adjustment. My mother moved through each of these without retreating from the goal. She was the kind of person who treated obstacles as scheduling problems, not verdicts. I want you to understand. The hotel was real. It was the product of years of serious work, and my mother cared about it the way you care about something you have risked real things for. That matters for what happened at the opening. It matters for understanding what she walked into. Now, let me tell you about me. I had moved back to Scottsdale 3 years before the Thanksgiving in question, coming home from Portland, Oregon, where I'd spent my late 20s working as a food and beverage operations manager for a mid-size hotel group. I had a hospitality management degree from Oregon State, 6 years of increasingly senior operations experience, and a functional understanding of how hotel restaurant programs actually work at the floor level, the procurement, the staffing models, the margin structure, the gap between what a menu promises and what a kitchen can consistently deliver. It is not glamorous knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge that keeps a restaurant profitable in year 3 when the opening excitement has worn off and the daily grind begins. I came back partly because my father had a cardiac event, resolved well, no lasting damage, but the kind of thing that recalibrates your geography, and partly because I had been offered a regional director role with a hospitality group managing 3 properties in the Phoenix metro area. The role was good. The timing was right. I came home. I met Marco Reyes at an industry panel 8 months after I returned. The panel was on restaurant program development in boutique hotel concepts, a narrow enough topic that the room was full of people who actually worked in the field and had opinions. Marco was one of the speakers. He was 37 at the time, dark-eyed, with the particular physical composure of someone who had spent years in professional kitchens and had learned to be calm under conditions that would rattle most people. He had flour on his left sleeve from something he'd been working on before the event, which he noticed partway through the evening and regarded briefly with the expression of a man who has long since accepted certain occupational realities. I found that endearing before I could have said why. His background was specific, 15 years split between culinary work and food and beverage consulting. He had started as a line cook at 19 in Chicago, worked his way through kitchens in New York and Denver, held an executive chef position at a boutique hotel property for 3 years, and then, the part that surprised most people when they learned it, pivoted at 32 into consulting. He advised hotel ownership groups on restaurant concept development, kitchen design, vendor sourcing, and menu architecture. He was not in the business of running restaurants. He was in the business of building the conditions under which good restaurants could exist, which is a more invisible kind of work and, if done well, more consequential. He was quiet about the consulting practice. Specialists often are when they've learned that explaining what they do in social settings requires more time than the conversation usually offers. We talked for over an hour after the panel, first about the substance of the discussion, then about specific operational problems I'd encountered in my own work, then about things that had nothing to do with work at all. He asked questions and listened to the answers in a way that made me remember, afterward, that I had felt completely attended to. That is a rarer quality than it should be. We went on 4 dates before I mentioned him to my mother. Her first question was what he did. I said he was a chef and a hospitality consultant. She asked if he had his own restaurant. I said no. He worked on the advisory side. There was a pause on her end of the phone, brief, managed, and then she said, "As long as you're happy, Nadia," which in her register meant, "I have a view on this and I am choosing not to say it yet." We dated for 18 months before Marco proposed. He did it in his apartment kitchen, late on a Saturday, while he was finishing a dish he'd been developing for a vendor pitch. He slid the ring across the counter between 2 prep bowls with such ordinary calm that it took me a moment to understand what was happening, and then I laughed, and he smiled in a way that meant he'd planned exactly that reaction. I said yes before the laugh had finished. My sister Nadia had married 2 years before I returned to Scottsdale. Her husband, Daniel Varga, was a commercial real estate attorney, organized, articulate, comfortable in my mother's social world in the way that certain people are comfortable in any room they've decided to inhabit. My mother adored him. She used his name at events with the pride of someone who has verified a particular investment. She said our son-in-law Daniel, in contexts where Renata's husband, would have been sufficient, and the difference in those 2 phrases told you everything about what he represented to her. Daniel was not a bad person. I want to be fair about that. He was simply the version of a son-in-law my mother had imagined, in a way that Marco was not. Marco and I were married on a Saturday in March, in a restaurant event space in downtown Scottsdale that belonged to a colleague of Marco's from his Denver years, a chef named Alicia who had built a 12-table restaurant in a converted 1940s building that had won a regional award 2 years running. It was exactly right for us. 40 guests. Marco's mother Elena and his 2 brothers drove in from Tucson. My father walked me down the aisle and wept, quietly at the end of it, turning his face slightly away as though the ceremony had surprised him even though he had planned for it. My mother attended. She gave a toast that was warm in form and technically gracious and mentioned Marco by name twice. She did not talk about his work. She talked about mine. The anchor of my life in the year that followed was Elena Reyes. Elena was 67, originally from Hermosillo, Mexico, a woman who had raised 3 sons largely on her own after Marco's father passed when Marco was 11. She had worked for 22 years as a hospital administrator in Tucson, and she carried the organizational precision of that work into everything she did. The way she planned a weekend visit, the way she listened to a problem, the way she cooked, which she did with the focused attention of someone who had learned that attention was itself a form of care. She visited us every 6 weeks and stayed for long weekends and treated our small Scottsdale house like it was exactly sufficient, which it was. She asked detailed questions about my work and remembered everything I'd told her the visit before. She was warm with my parents when she met them at the wedding and warm about them in conversations afterward, even when the subject was complicated, and that warmth was not performed. She said to me once, about 5 months after the wedding, during one of those long weekend visits, while we were washing up after dinner, "Nadia, do you know what Marco's done with all those years of work?" I said I knew some of it.
She handed me a dish to dry. "He doesn't tell people," she said.
"Not because he's hiding. Because he decided a long time ago that the work should speak for itself. He said to me once, when he was about 30, 'If I have to announce it, it's not working.'" She looked at me. "You're the kind of person who understands that. Not many people do." I asked her what she meant by what he'd done with all those years. She smiled with the particular patience of someone who has decided to let an answer arrive on its own schedule.
"Ask him," she said.
I asked him that night, at the kitchen table, after Elena had gone to bed. He was quiet for a long moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding something. Then he opened his laptop and showed me a folder. What was in that folder I will tell you about, but not yet. What I will tell you is that after I had looked at what was in it and asked questions over the course of the next several weeks and understood what I was looking at, I sat with the knowledge the way you sit with something that reframes what you already knew. I thought about my mother. I thought about the pauses on the phone and what they contained. I thought about the words she had used, nothing, in a sentence she had not yet said to me directly, though I was beginning to understand it was coming. It came at Thanksgiving. My mother's Thanksgiving was not a casual occasion. It was a production. The good china, the wines chosen with purpose, the seating arrangement that communicated the family's current social geometry as clearly as any document. She had hosted it for 16 years in Scottsdale, and it had become, over those years, the event around which the family's understanding of itself was refreshed and updated. That year, there were 24 people at the extended table: my parents, Renata and Daniel, my mother's 2 sisters with their families, my father's brother and his wife, a selection of cousins, and 2 of my mother's civic colleagues who had become sufficiently woven into the family's social fabric that their presence at the table was simply assumed. It was a full room. The kind of Thanksgiving where the noise never fully drops below a certain level and conversation is a series of parallel rivers rather than one stream. Marco and I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He had made something for the table, a dessert I'll describe in a moment, because it matters, and brought it in a white box carefully wrapped, the way he handled anything he made for other people's tables. The first 2 hours were as they always were. My father circulated with the relaxed confidence of a man who is genuinely glad to see everyone. Daniel held court near the living room with the ease of someone who has learned how to be comfortable in any conversation. My mother moved through the gathering with the particular focused attention she gave to hosting, monitoring, adjusting, ensuring, and was, as always, correct and welcoming to Marco without being warm. Marco spent a significant portion of the afternoon in the kitchen with my Aunt Margaret, who was a serious home cook and had been working on a roasted pepper preparation for 2 years that she couldn't get quite right. He sat with her for 40 minutes while the rest of the gathering happened elsewhere, talking through the preparation in the specific, unhurried way he talked about food, and at the end of it Margaret was taking notes on a piece of paper towel and nodding with the focused energy of someone who has just received genuinely useful information. I looked in on them once. I left them to it. Dinner was served at 4:30. 24 people at the extended table, the conversation settling into the longer rhythms that come with serious food and poured wine. My mother's cooking was one of her genuine gifts, thorough, precise, the kind of food that communicates effort without announcing it. The meal was good. Marco had put his dessert on the sideboard when we arrived, a walnut and honey cake from a recipe his mother had given him, adjusted for ingredients he sourced locally. He'd packaged it carefully in that white box with a sheet of parchment over the top. My mother had thanked him for it and set it beside her own baked goods on the sideboard, without further comment. By the time the table had settled into the dessert stage, the wine was well established, and the conversation had reached the looser, associative register that follows a large shared meal. My cousin Petra, recently engaged, had been asking the table for advice about property and timing. Daniel gave the tax implications answer, which was correct and complete. My mother added something about the importance of knowing what you're building toward as a family. She looked at Renata and Daniel with the warmth she kept specifically for that subject. Then she said, "Some people know that from the start. Renata found someone who understands what this family is building, what we represent." She paused. Not everyone makes that same choice. She looked at me across the table with the expression she used when she was being generous about something she disagreed with. "Nadia has always done things her own way. We respect that. Your sister married up, and that's something to be proud of. Nadia made a different choice, and we just hope it works out." The table did what tables do in that moment. A brief contraction, eyes that found safer ground, a drop in the ambient conversation level that was not quite silence but was close enough. Marco was to my left. He had been halfway through a bite of my mother's pumpkin tart. He finished it, set down his fork with the precise, unhurried movement of a man choosing what to do with his hands. Then he picked up his coffee cup, which still had coffee in it, and cradled it in both palms. "We'll be fine," he said. Not directed at my mother. Not a defense. Just a statement, offered into the table, like a weight being set down in a specific place. My father, at the far end, looked up from his plate, and then at me, and then back at his plate. Something moved through his face that he closed off before it reached his expression. I looked at my mother. I looked at the white box on the sideboard, still mostly full, because the table had been generous to her own baked goods first. I looked at the table in front of me. I thought about the folder Marco had opened on his laptop 7 weeks earlier. I thought about what I had seen in it, and what I had spent the subsequent weeks coming to understand, and I thought about Meridian Collective, the name of my mother's investment partner on the Kovac at Fifth, and the contract I had found in that folder with that name on it, signed 4 months before this Thanksgiving, for a food and beverage consulting engagement on a boutique hotel project in Scottsdale's Arts District. And I said nothing. Not because I had nothing. Because the room for it was not this table, with the wine and the pumpkin tart and 24 people in the particular social configuration of a family holiday. The room for it was somewhere else. And I was willing to wait for that room. My grandmother on my mother's side, Bet, 79, small and sharp, who had been listening to the table from her position near the window with the focused attention of a woman who has spent 8 decades learning to read rooms, set down her water glass with a deliberateness that was itself a comment. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. She picked up her water glass again and took a sip and looked at my mother in a way that my mother chose not to acknowledge. The meal moved on. There were other conversations. Marco complimented my Aunt Margot's stuffed peppers and helped clear the dessert plates when the table began to thin, which he did without being asked and without announcing it. We left at 7. In the car on the way home, I sat in the passenger seat and watched the Scottsdale streetlights run past and said nothing for several minutes. Marco drove. He did not push. "Are you all right?" he said eventually. "I will be," I said. "Give me until we get home." He gave me the drive. In the months that followed, the gap between my mother and me widened in the way gaps do when they are not addressed directly, through accumulating small absences. Phone calls became shorter. The family occasions that might have occurred found reasons not to happen. My mother was consumed by the final construction phase of the hotel, which was entering the most demanding period of the project, and her attention was genuinely elsewhere. I told myself that was most of it. I think it was some of it. My father called once a month, separately. These calls were about practical things, a water heater, a property question, the neighborhood, and near the end of each one he asked about Marco in the specific way he asked about things he wanted to know more about but wasn't sure he had the right to pursue. I told him the consulting work was going well. He said good, and the word carried more weight than it usually does. Renata, and I were cordial. We texted around the edges of things. She had not said what my mother said, and she had not countered it either, and I held both of those facts at a neutral distance and tried not to assign them more meaning than they warranted. Elena called every other Sunday and asked real questions and listened to the real answers. Once, about 3 months after Thanksgiving, she asked me how things stood with my mother. I said, "We're in a quiet period." She was quiet herself for a moment. Then she said, "Quiet periods end. They end better when you've decided in advance what you want from the other side of them." I thought about that for a long time afterward. What I wanted, I came to understand, was not an apology. Not exactly. What I wanted was for my mother to see Marco as he actually was, not the category she had assigned him, not the job title, not the absence of a restaurant with his name on the window. What she actually was. And for that seeing to happen in a way that I hadn't engineered, hadn't arranged, hadn't inserted myself into as the agent of the correction. I wanted reality to do it. The soft opening invitation arrived 4 months before the event, formal cardstock, addressed to both Marco and me, from the Kovac at Fifth's organizing committee. I found it in the mail on a Wednesday evening and set it on the kitchen counter. Marco came home an hour later, read it, set it back down. "Meridian asked me to be there," he said. "They're introducing the restaurant program at the opening. They want me to speak about the concept." I picked the invitation up again. My mother's name on the organizing committee letterhead, alongside Meridian Collectives. "You're speaking," I said. "Briefly," he said. 10, 12 minutes. I set the invitation down. "Then we should go," I said. He looked at me with the look he used when he wanted to know how I was actually doing. "We should go," I said again. "Wear the gray jacket." He almost smiled. "All right," he said. The Kovac at Fifth Hotel soft opening was held on a Friday evening in late October, the right season for an outdoor-adjacent event in Scottsdale, before the winter season had fully arrived but past the worst of the desert heat. The building was everything my mother had spent 4 years working toward, and I want to give her that clearly before I tell you what happened inside it. The original structure was a 1937 residential hotel, and the design team had honored its bones while rebuilding around them, preserved tile work in the lobby floor, the original staircase restored and centered, ceilings at their original height rather than dropped to accommodate modern infrastructure. The new additions were deliberate and specific. Warm plaster walls, custom light fixtures that gave the space the quality of late afternoon regardless of the actual hour, a restaurant off the lobby through a wide archway with an open kitchen and 40 seats arranged to feel spacious without feeling empty. It was a beautiful hotel. That is simply true. The guest list for the soft opening was approximately 180. Meridian Collective's investors and partners, civic contacts of my mother's, hospitality industry professionals, local food and beverage press, and the hotel's opening staff. A representative cross-section of the world my mother had built her professional life inside for 30 years. We arrived at 6:20, 20 minutes into the cocktail hour. I wore a dress I'd been saving for the right occasion. Deep rust, structured shoulders, the kind of thing that holds up across a long evening. Marco wore the gray jacket over a collarless shirt, which was correct for the room without being formal enough to seem like he was trying. He looked, as he always did, completely at ease in himself. The lobby when we walked in was perhaps half full and active, catering staff moving trays of small plates through the crowd, a guitarist somewhere near the restored staircase, the ambient sound of 150 people who mostly knew each other finding their way through the opening social geometry. I registered the space with the professional part of my mind that always does that first flow, sightlines, service positioning, and then I let it go and just stood in it. The appetizers circulating through the room were Marco's program in miniature, a small tostada with a crema that had a particular depth that came from a sourcing decision I knew he'd made about a specific local dairy, a stuffed medjool date with a spice combination that was his adaptation of something from his mother's kitchen, a tartlet with a roasted squash filling that used 3 ingredients from a farm network he'd been developing vendor relationships with for 6 months. I took one of each and ate them at the edge of the room and thought, everyone in this space is tasting his work and doesn't know it yet. A member of Meridian's events team found Marco within 5 minutes of our arrival and took him briefly aside, the kind of pre-event logistics conversation that means someone is about to be asked to do something in front of people. Marco thanked her and returned to me with the settled expression of a man who knows what he's doing and has no particular feelings about doing it.
20 minutes, he said.
I nodded. I found Renata near the entrance to the restaurant space. She was with Daniel and two people I didn't recognize. She saw me, and the brief recalibration in her face was not unfriendly. It was the adjustment of someone placing a person in a context she hadn't anticipated.
Nadia, she said.
You're here. We are, I said. She glanced at Marco, who was nearby speaking with a vendor contact. Is he? She stopped.
He's speaking tonight, I said.
About the restaurant program. Her expression moved through something she didn't complete.
Mom doesn't know, she said.
It was not a question. Meridian handles their own consultants, I said. It wasn't something Mom was in the loop on their side. Renata looked at me for a moment with the look of someone revising a calculation. Then she said quietly, okay. I moved away. I found my father near the bar, talking to a man I recognized from the Meridian Investment Group. My father saw me and his face did the thing it did when he was genuinely glad, a particular settling, like something tensed had been given permission to release. He put his arm around me briefly, which was his form of embrace at public events, and asked how I was doing.
Good, I said.
You should find a good spot for the presentation. He looked at me for a moment. Is there something I should know?
Find a good spot, I said.
He studied my face with the patience of a man who has learned when not to ask follow-up questions. Then he nodded and moved toward the presentation area. I did not see my mother until 10 minutes before the program started. She came from the direction of the back of the hotel. She had been with the Meridian team in the operations area, doing the final logistics review that her nature required her to do even when the professional team had it handled. She was in a dark plum suit I recognized as new, her hair precisely arranged, moving through the lobby with the specific quality of someone who has arrived at something they have been building toward and is allowing themselves, for one evening, to feel it.
She saw Renata first.
Then Daniel. Then she tracked left and found me. A half-second pause. Managed immediately. She came toward me with her arms open and said, Nadia, I'm so glad you're here. I let her embrace me. It's beautiful, Mom, I said. You did it. She looked around the lobby, the tile work, the light, the archway into the restaurant, and something in her face opened in a way I rarely saw it open. It came together, she said. And for a moment she sounded like herself before the hotel, before the planning and the setbacks and the years of sustained effort. She sounded like a woman who had wanted something and gotten it, and could simply feel that.
It really did, I said.
She didn't ask about Marco. I didn't say where he was. The program began at 7. A Meridian staff member gathered the room toward the restaurant archway, where a small raised area had been arranged with a podium and a screen. The crowd organized itself with the efficiency of people who are accustomed to events and know how to find a position. I placed myself to the left of the main cluster, with a clear line of sight to the podium and an unobstructed view of the section of the room where my mother had positioned herself between Renata and one of the Meridian co-founders. Marcus, Meridian's director of hospitality, opened the program. He spoke about the Kovac at Fifth's concept, the design philosophy, the investment thesis, what they believed the property would mean for Scottsdale's boutique hotel landscape. He was good at this kind of talk, specific without being technical, enthusiastic without overselling. The room was attentive. Then he said, the piece of this project we're most proud of, and honestly the piece that took the longest to get right, is the restaurant program. A hotel can be architecturally extraordinary and still feel hollow if the food doesn't work. We knew that from the beginning, and we made a significant investment in getting it right. He paused. That investment has a name. Marco Reyes has been our food and beverage consultant on this project for the past 14 months. He developed the concept, the kitchen specifications, the vendor relationships, the menu architecture. If you've been eating the appetizers tonight, you've been tasting his program. Marco stepped forward from where he'd been standing to the left of the presentation area. He thanked Marcus. He thanked the Meridian team. He spoke for 11 minutes about the restaurant program, the sourcing philosophy, the kitchen design decisions, the concept's relationship to the regional food culture, the opening team he'd helped select. He spoke with a particular quiet authority of someone who knows exactly what they've done and has no need to amplify it. He used the word "we" throughout, referring to the team, which was characteristic. The room listened with the full attention of a hospitality industry audience that recognizes expertise when it encounters it. I watched my mother. The sequence happened in visible stages. First, the name. Her head turned toward the podium when Marcus said Marco Reyes, and her face was in the specific arrangement of someone who has heard a familiar word in an unfamiliar context and is placing it. Second, recognition. The placing happened. I watched it happen. The moment when the category she had constructed for Marco, the job title, the absence of a restaurant, the coffee cup at the Thanksgiving table, collided with the man standing at the podium of her hotel's opening event, describing the work he had done on her restaurant program for the past 14 months. Third, the stillness. She went completely still. Her champagne flute, which had been at a natural resting position at her side, stopped moving. Her shoulders, which in her usual social posture had the slight forward energy of engagement, dropped back and settled in the way that happens when a body has been asked to process something it was not prepared for. Renata, beside her, had both hands wrapped around her wine glass with a grip that was not casual, and her eyes were moving between the podium and me and back, the triangulation of someone trying to assemble a picture from its parts. My mother's gaze, after a long moment, found me across the room. I looked back at her. I did not change my expression. I did not nod, or gesture, or perform anything. I simply looked back at her, standing where I was, with my hands at my sides, and let her see me in the room her husband's money and her years of work had built, at the opening of the restaurant program my husband had designed. For 3 seconds we held that. Then I turned back to the podium, where Marco was thanking the opening kitchen team by name, one by one, with the attention of a man who believes that people who do the work deserve to be seen for it. The room's response to Marco's presentation had the specific quality of a room that has been reoriented. Not dramatically, there was no gasp, no moment of theater.
It was subtler than that.
It was the sound and movement of 170 hospitality professionals recalibrating a person against a prior impression, and the recalibration was visible in the way rooms make things visible, in posture, in the direction of attention, in who turned to speak to whom, and what their faces did when they did it. Marcus from Meridian came to find me before the program had fully dispersed into the cocktail and conversation phase of the evening. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Your husband is extraordinary.
I want you to know that.
We've worked with a lot of consultants, and I have never had one who understood the full system the way he does. The kitchen, the sourcing, the concept, the team, the margin. It all coheres. That's rare." I thanked him and said I agreed, and had found that to be true consistently. He laughed slightly. "We'd like to talk to him about what comes next," he said. "We have 2 more properties in development. I think you can guess who we'd want involved." I said I'd let Marco know, which I did. The food critic I'd noticed earlier, a woman named Jennifer who wrote for 2 regional publications and had been taking notes on her phone throughout Marco's presentation, introduced herself to me about 20 minutes after the program ended. She said she'd been hoping to profile the Kovac at Fifth's restaurant program, and that after hearing Marco speak, she'd realized the story was bigger than the hotel. The sourcing network alone, she said. Direct relationships with 11 farms. No distributor markup on 4 of the primary produce lines. Do you know how unusual that is for an opening? She asked whether Marco would be willing to speak with her before she filed. I said I thought he would. A Meridian co-founder, a man named Richard who is 60 and had the unhurried manner of someone who has been making significant decisions for long enough that he no longer feels the need to signal their weight, found me near the restaurant archway and said, "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've met 2 or 3 people who can do what Marco does. If you have any influence over where he takes the next engagement, I'd ask you to put us at the top of the list." He said it matter-of-factly, as a professional statement, not a social one. I told him I'd pass it along. The woman from the county planning office who had worked on the hotel's permitting said she hadn't realized Marco was my husband and introduced herself specifically to make the connection. A vendor from Marco's sourcing network recognized me from a site visit months earlier, and I came to say that working with Marco had changed how he thought about what his farm was producing and for whom. None of this was arranged. None of it was performance. It was simply what happens when someone's actual work becomes visible in a room full of people who understand the field. I had not approached my mother. She found me approximately 50 minutes after the program, when the cocktail hour was thinning toward its natural end. She came across the room with the deliberate movement of a woman who has decided to do something and is doing it before she can change her mind. She stopped in front of me. She was very controlled, but the control was effortful in a way her control usually wasn't. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. A pause. "How long has he been working on this?" 14 months, I said. The contract was signed in August. She looked at me. "Before Thanksgiving." "Yes," I said. Something moved across her face that I did not name and did not chase. She looked toward the restaurant archway, where Marco was visible through the opening, speaking with Sandra from Meridian and 2 members of the opening kitchen team, his jacket still buttoned, his hands moving in the small precise gestures he used when he was explaining something he cared about. "He's very good," she said. The words were quiet, and they were not easy. "He is," I said. She looked back at me. "I said something at Thanksgiving that I should not have said." "You did," I said. A longer pause. The lobby was still active around us. Catering staff moving, guests circulating, the quiet sound of an event winding toward its end. In the middle of it, my mother and I stood 4 feet apart in the hotel she had built, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been shown that her measurement was wrong, and is in the process of understanding what that means. "I'd like to call you this week," she said. "Okay," I said. She nodded. She put her hand on my arm for a moment, briefly, the gesture of someone who wants to say more than the moment has room for, and then withdrew it and moved back toward the Meridian team. My father appeared at my elbow about 3 minutes later. He had 2 glasses of water, and he handed me one without comment. "He was impressive," he said.
He was himself, I said.
"That's why he was impressive." My father drank his water and looked at the restaurant archway, and then at me. "I should have said something at Thanksgiving," he said. "I didn't." "I know," I said. "I know why." He nodded. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, one hand, one beat, then gone, and moved back toward his brother-in-law. Marco found me near the coat check at 9:45. He had his jacket off, folded over one arm. He looked the way he always looked after a professional event, settled, slightly tired, ready for quiet. "Ready," he said. "Yes," I said. We drove home with the windows cracked, the October air cool and dry, the city moving past us at the speed of a Friday night. I sat in the passenger seat with my heels off and my feet tucked under me and thought about the lobby and the champagne flute and the 4 seconds of eye contact across a room.
"You all right?" he said.
"Yes," I said. "More than." He put his hand on mine for a moment, briefly, the way he did when words were adjacent but not required. We got home at 10:15.
He made tea.
I changed into comfortable clothes. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about what Richard from Meridian had said, and what Jennifer the critic had asked, and whether the new engagement was the right one to take, and whether the sourcing model could scale to a second property without losing what made it work. We talked about the work, the way we always did. My mother called on a Thursday, 9 days after the opening. I was at my desk at the regional office when her name appeared on my phone. I let it ring once, finished the sentence I was writing, and answered. "Nadia." Her voice had the quality of someone who has been preparing and is now doing the thing they prepared for. "I want to talk about the opening, about what you heard me say at Thanksgiving, about Marco." "Okay," I said. She was quiet for a moment, not the managed quiet of her usual social composure, but the real kind, the kind where the person is finding the order for what they've decided to say. "I made a judgment," she said, "about who he was and what he was worth, and I made it without looking, without asking, without giving him any credit for what he'd built." A pause. "I've been doing this work for 30 years. I know that the people who are actually good at things are often the people who aren't talking about it. I know that. And I still didn't apply it." I said, "No." "I was wrong," she said.
About him.
And I was wrong to say what I said in front of the family about your marriage and your choices. Her voice was even, but it had cost her something to make it so. I would like to apologize to Marco directly, if he's willing. I said I would ask him. She said, I'd also like to apologize to you. I was quiet for a moment. I'm listening, I said. She said it. Simply, without the scaffolding of explanation or context. She said she was sorry. She said she had let her idea of what the family needed override her ability to see what was actually in front of her. She said she didn't expect that to land immediately, and she understood if it took time. I told her I heard her. I told her it would take some time, and that was honest, and she said she understood. Jennifer's piece ran in 2 regional publications the following week, one food-focused, one general hospitality industry. Both named Marco and described the restaurant program in specific enough terms that the sourcing network and the concept architecture were clearly legible. Both mentioned that it was the most fully developed opening program either writer had encountered at a Scottsdale boutique property. One of them noted that Marco Reyes had previously consulted on properties in Denver and Santa Fe, and that the Kovac at Fifth represented his most ambitious single engagement to date. My mother, I was told secondhand by my father, read both pieces the morning they published. Richard from Meridian's conversation with Marco became a formal proposal 6 weeks after the opening, a 2-property consulting engagement over 18 months, covering the full food and beverage program from concept through operational handoff on both sites. It was the largest engagement Marco had ever taken on. He came home from the meeting and made dinner, the way he did when he needed to think, and we talked through the scope and the structure and the risks until after midnight. He took the engagement. Renata called me on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the opening. She said she'd seen the pieces in the publications and that she'd talked to Daniel about what she should say to me, and that what she'd concluded was that she owed me an honest conversation. She said she had not pushed back at Thanksgiving when she should have. She said she had known it wasn't right and had let it pass anyway because it was easier, and that the ease of it was not a defense. I said, I know. She said, Are you angry at me?
I thought about it.
Not anymore, I said. I was. She said she was glad I told her that honestly, and not the easier version. I said I'd learned it from Marco, who had an allergy to the easier version of things. She laughed briefly, which was the first time Renata and I had laughed together in over a year. We did eventually have dinner at my parents' house, the 4 of us, plus my parents, plus Renata and Daniel. My mother cooked for 3 hours, which was her particular form of apology made material. She put Marco's walnut cake on the table. She had found the recipe from Margaret, who had apparently asked Marco for it at Christmas, and when we sat down she said, simply, Marco, I owe you an apology, and I owe you my thanks. Both are long overdue. She said it in front of everyone. No preamble, no scaffolding.
Just that.
Marco looked at her and said, Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate that. Not, it's fine. Not, don't worry about it. Just, I appreciate that. Which was the honest response and the only one he would have given. We ate dinner. The conversation moved through the usual family channels. Work, the new engagement, my father's properties, a cousin's news. At one point my mother asked Marco a question about the sourcing network, genuinely curious, specifically phrased, the kind of question that told you she had read the pieces and thought about what she'd read. He answered with a focused attention he gave to anything he'd been asked about directly. They talked for 15 minutes about food, which was the first real conversation they'd had in the 3 years they'd known each other. That was a beginning. Not a repair, not yet, but a beginning, built on something true. Here is the thing I come back to, now that enough time has passed to see the shape of it clearly. My mother is not an unintelligent woman. She is one of the more perceptive people I have ever known. She built a hotel from a vision and a piece of distressed real estate, navigating every obstacle between the idea and the ribbon cutting with a combination of stubbornness and social intelligence that I genuinely admire. She reads rooms. She reads people. Those are real skills. And she looked at Marco for 3 years and did not see him. Not because she couldn't. Because she had already decided what he was before she looked. She had a category. The cook, the consultant without a restaurant, The man who didn't match what she'd imagined for her daughter, and she put him in it and stopped checking. The category was the instrument, and the instrument was wrong, and because she trusted the instrument, she stopped observing. What the lobby gave her was the thing the instrument had missed: the actual record. Not a rebuttal, not an argument, not me telling her she was wrong. The room, telling the truth. 180 people hearing about sourcing networks and kitchen specifications, and 14 months of work that had been sitting in a contract file at Meridian Collective. Entirely real, entirely visible, entirely unremarked upon at any family dinner because Marco had never seen the need to remark upon it. He wasn't building for the room. He was building for the work. And eventually the room and the work are in the same space at the same time, and that is all that needs to happen. I think about that a lot. About what it costs to decide early and stop looking. About what it costs the people you've decided about. And about the fact that in the end, reality doesn't need your help. It just needs time and a room and someone who is patient enough to still be standing in it. That's my story. A white box with a walnut cake that sat mostly full on a sideboard while the table served itself from my mother's baking first. A moment in a hotel lobby where a woman who built something beautiful discovered she didn't know everything about what she'd built. And a dinner, months later, where my mother asked my husband a real question and listened to the real answer, and that was where it actually started. Here is what I want to ask you, and I mean it as a real question. Have you ever been in a room where someone you loved was being underestimated by your family, your friends, your community, and you knew something they didn't, and you had to decide whether to say it or wait for reality to say it for you? What did you do? And looking back, do you think you made the right call? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.